Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss the increasing trend of teachers leaving teaching. But first, I recently spoke with Professor Joseph Dippong of the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, about his recent paper titled Vocal Accommodation and Perceptions of Speakers' Prestige and Dominance. The paper is to be published in Social Psychology Quarterly and is co-authored by Will Kalkhoff and Cayce Jamil. Professor Dippong, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, the title of your paper suggests there may be a relationship between the prestige of a speaker and vocal accommodation.
Yeah.
What is vocal accommodation? Just to get started.
I'm glad you asked that because that really underpins everything that I'm trying to do in this paper. So there's kind of a long story that goes behind, how we got to this point in the research. But basically, I'm going to start off by explaining a little bit about what we call behavioral or interactional synchrony. So as people interact with each other, either face-to-face or over Zoom like this, research in communications going back into the 60s and 70s has shown that while people interact, they tend to synchronize their behaviors in certain ways. And you may have seen this, like, for example, if you're in a coffee shop and you see two people that know each other well and they both, simultaneously take a drink at the same time, or they cross their legs together, or they lean in together, we tend to synchronize our behaviors with those around us. And we synchronize also with ourselves. Like, we can often notice somebody will synchronize their hand motions with their speech and things like that. So some researchers have documented there's a couple of different ways that we synchronize with other people, aside from the ways that we synchronize with ourselves. We synchronize in those sort of outward behaviors that I was just talking about, in terms of, just the observable things that, the crossing of the legs but we also synchronize in some really interesting and unexpected ways. Even back in the 60s, it was documented that people in interaction, their brainwaves begin to synchronize with those, documented using EEG. People's the brainwaves were synchronizing in a way that they were creating this sort of specific fingerprint local to that interaction in their brainwaves. And in the 1980s, a scholar by the name of Stan Gregory decided that he was really interested in this concept of internal synchrony, this biological synchrony that isn't, the observable kind. And he was looking at the voice. So what he found is that as people talk, their voices began to match each other in certain ways, and creating a similar kind of vocal frequency fingerprint, like the brainwaves did when previous scholars studied that. So to go a little bit further into that, so the human voice is composed of hundreds and hundreds of individual frequencies that we hear as a kind of a single tone. But just like you can pass light through a prism and see all of the constituent color frequencies, you can pass the voice through a sort of acoustic prism that breaks it down into its constituent frequencies. And there's several different conceptual bands of those frequencies. And the area that this kind of research really focuses on is what we call the nonverbal frequency band. So if you were to think about the nonverbal versus the verbal frequency bands, in the verbal frequency bands, those contain like the intelligible message of a speech act. So the words, the message that I'm trying to convey here. And if you were to strip out the nonverbal range, it would sound really tinny and high pitch. But if you were to just listen to the nonverbal range, that contains almost like the bass tones and the emotional content, the tone of voice. And if you listen to that, it sounds almost like you're listening to speech through a wall. You can tell it's a voice, but you can't pick up the actual message, the manifest content of it. So Stan Gregory found that in those nonverbal ranges of the voice, those frequencies, we tend to match up with our partners. And then it got further developed in building off of another area of communications research called Accommodation Theory. That basically the argument developed that as people's voices and their vocal frequencies were converging, people were not contributing equally to that convergence. One person tended to be moving more toward the other. And so that's what we would call accommodation. When one person does more of that work, puts in more of the effort towards reaching that convergence, everybody gets the interactional benefits of convergence, which are, feeling of social closeness and solidarity, enhanced communication, and things like that. But it seems like one person tends to do more of the work than the other. And so the idea of accommodation, vocal accommodation, came about when several studies kind of validated this idea that one person will put in more work, and then that got tied more to social dimensions of status and power. It seemed that the lower status person, or the less powerful person in an interaction, was doing more of the work. They were accommodating the higher status person, so that lower status people were adjusting their behaviors to match their higher status partners. So that's what vocal accommodation is in a nutshell.
So is this something that's produced consciously and controllable? People go into an interaction and they as the interaction unfolds, they consciously accommodate to the other, or consciously refuse to accommodate to the other?
So I think sort of the most compelling argument that it is not conscious is that those nonverbal frequencies of the voice are almost impossible to consciously manipulate. Even if you're giving it deep, intentional action, you have a hard time producing those behaviors, controlling what those frequencies do. And in fact, just to kind of point out how the non-conscious aspect of it works, I would go out on a limb and say that at this point in time, you and I have reached some form of vocal convergence, and I would be willing to bet that neither of us has given any thought to that. It just happens. It's kind of I would argue we're biologically programmed to do this.
I see. So, well, what have other studies of vocal accommodation found? I mean, you said part of it was that the person the more vulnerable, or the person with less power, may be doing more of the work. Is there any evidence on whether the degree to which a conversation has vocal accommodation has any impact on something, or in social life, or who, what observers, what is the research found that's relevant for where we're going?
So what's really interesting, most of the research, in fact, I would say almost all of the research to this point, has been done in sort of this basic science approach, where we're just accumulating knowledge for the sake of knowledge and trying to really understand the mechanisms and processes of vocal accommodation. But with some recent studies, like a study that I cite repeatedly in this paper, work by Kalkhoff and colleagues in 2017, a paper I published in 2020, and then this one, we've really kind of answered some of the big picture questions. And now we're starting to move into those more applied areas of research, where instead of just trying to look at, how does vocal accommodation function, we're now starting to think about things like, what does this mean? How can we use this? How can we, apply this so that it's beneficial to not just scientists, but to society in general? So I can't point to any previous studies that really do that, though, except for maybe one in the early 2000s looked at vocal accommodation between patients and doctors to see, so the degree of deference that people were giving the doctors and how their different medical outcomes were tied to that. So that's one sort of hint at how this could be useful. But there's a number of studies kind of in the works right now that are looking at the practical implications of this. One that I'm kind of in the very early stages of looking at is, given that what we know about status and power differences and its effect on the voice, I'm in the very early stages of developing a study to see if, for example, we can use vocal accommodation as a non-conscious unobtrusive measure of something like implicit racial bias, so that we can measure these things in the moment instead of using these, computer-based tasks after the fact to measure whether somebody has these implicit biases, whether we can, correlate that with things that are going on in the voice, and use that to develop different types of interventions. My colleague, Will Kalkhoff, is working on a really fascinating study using vocal accommodation to look at what happens in groups where the person who's in charge doesn't know what they're doing. So how do people engage in deferent or dominant behaviors when they're being told by a leader or given orders from a leader who doesn't know what they're doing? And what does the voice do in these types of situations when it's a really high stress or risky type of situation, when you're under threat? So these are, so Kalkhoff is kind of tackling the incompetent leader issue that we see in a lot. I'm sure nobody who's watching this has ever encountered that, but it's a really cool application. And then our other author, Cayce Jamil, is just finishing up research that he's looking at. He's using kind of the fact that vocal accommodation measures both solidarity and status differences. And he's looking at how different approaches to trying to reduce gender inequality in organizations has positive or negative impact on the solidarity that people experience in groups. So whether we disrupt the sort of basic status assumptions that people bring into mixed sex interactions, whether that impacts the solidarity between people too. So that has implications for the kinds of things that organizations are involved in terms of creating more egalitarian workforces and things like that.
So this study, some studies, I take existing conversations in the wild. Mm-hmm. And then they have been recorded for one reason or another, then they analyze them. Mm-hmm. But your study is creating or harvesting a conversation that's been, you've set up a context, and then, so it's kind of it's an experiment.
Yes, this is definitely an experiment.
So one of the questions I had is, so in an experiment, you need to assign treatments randomly, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the treatments in your study is the person's social status. You're trying to figure out what the role that is and who accommodates and how. But people enter an interaction with, whatever prestige or social status they bring with them. And, that's not randomly assigned. That's just given by, external conditions.
Correct.
So in your experiment, were you able to randomly assign high and low state prestige or status? And if not, what did you do to make it work in the experiment?
So yeah, in the particular design that I used, we did randomly assign people to occupy either a higher or lower status position. So we brought people into our lab in groups of two, but they had never met each other before, and they didn't even see each other at all during the experiment. We kept them in separate rooms, separate locations. So when those two people walked in the room, it was essentially a coin flip as to who was going to be assigned to higher or lower status. And that helps us control for a lot of the potential competing explanations for what might actually be causing vocal accommodation. If we can actually assign status positions within groups, then that gives us a little bit of extra assurance that we're really demonstrating that one thing is causing another. That's really a key part of doing experiments. So one of the advantages of keeping people separate is that we then control all of the information that they have about each other. So they don't know each other's age, they don't know each other's necessarily their race. We put people together in same-sex groups to control for gender as a status characteristic. And then, there's been a whole bunch of research that has developed these sort of artificial status characteristics where you can induce status differences in groups by giving people these tests and assigning them values on those tests about certain abilities and characteristics. So you tell one person, oh, you scored really well on this particular ability or this characteristic, and your partner scored less well. And these artificially created status characteristics function the same way as naturally occurring status characteristics like race, class, gender, education, things like that. So, research has shown that you stack them up side by side, these artificial ones, for the purposes of controlling and testing, they work really well. Plus, they have the advantage, I could have brought people in and used race, class, gender, things like that to manipulate the status differences. But the thing with those is people bring in pre-existing beliefs, people bring in beliefs about displaying socially desirable behaviors and things like that. So you don't necessarily get at what's really going on. So using characteristics that are completely fabricated there in the lab, you get past all of their presuppositions and their attempts to engage in this sort of impression management that they're going to show, a particular view of themselves.
So you don't just tell the person you're lower status or you're higher status. You have this scientifically verified fake test.
Yes.
You give them, and then at the end of it, you say, "Oh, well, you didn't do so well, so but you're paired with this person that did very well."
Yes.
Or vice versa, and then that. So it's so that sounds pretty potentially powerful. People might take that in, and
I should make it clear that at the end of the experiment, I let them know that about the manipulation, so that they don't walk away thinking that this person was better than them or worse than them. I make sure that they know that what has just happened to them, so we can get rid of any negative feelings people have about being assigned to a low status position. We don't like that.
Right. So that's ethically nice to at the end to say, okay, that's good. So with this experiment-based approach, which is different in some ways from what people have done where they harvest or take recordings that already existed and then try to figure out, what did you find with respect to participants? How were they responding? What role did vocal accommodation play, or was it, what'd you find?
So we did a couple of different analyses. We looked at we looked at the group members themselves. So we created a situation where they kind of, after we manipulated those status differences and created a status structure in the group, we had them engage in about a 10 to 15 minute conversation where they kind of played a game where they had to figure out how to survive together in a fictitious survival situation. And really, it didn't matter what they were talking about so long as they were doing it cooperatively and they were trying to solve a problem together. And so what we found, consistent with previous research, is that the person who was randomly assigned to the lower status position did engage in significantly more vocal accommodation than those assigned to the higher status position. So the mechanism functioned kind of exactly as we had hoped it would. But we're also interested in what aspects of an interaction partner, what structural aspects beyond just that manipulation might be driving this process of accommodation. So we measured people's perceptions of each other's prestige, which is related to status, and also the perceptions of each other's dominance, which is kind of related to power. So we think of status, there's a couple of different ways that you can gain influence in a group. Through status, which is when people voluntarily defer to you because they think you know more than them or they value your input. And then there's power, and dominance. So that would be when people defer to you because there's some sort of coercive element, or you're a domineering person, or you talk over them. So there's a couple different ways that social interaction could be driving this vocal accommodation. We're interested whether it was more a prestige-based outcome or a dominance-based outcome. And what we found is that it's actually kind of at least among the group members themselves, it's a mix of the two. So our measure of vocal accommodation was closely associated with their perceptions of each other's prestige and closely associated with measures of each other's dominance, but it was more strongly predictive of prestige than of dominance. So it's kind of a mix of those two things. We weren't quite sure how that would shake out because previous research has really found strong evidence in favor of dominance in certain types of groups, in more competitive groups, but nobody had really looked at the kind of groups that we were looking at here yet.
So, and you also, there was an element of in a lot of conversations, there are the people who are engaged in the conversation, but there are also the people who might be observing the conversation.
Right.
And in your analysis, you brought the observers in, and did they have the same read of this interaction as the participants, or was it, what did you find?
Yeah, so that was one of the big research questions that we were trying to tackle here, because decades of social psychological research shows that the stories you tell yourself about what's going on when you're engaged in an action are very different from what happens when you see somebody else engaged in that same type of action. We bring more nuanced information to our understanding of our own behaviors than we do to, say, the behaviors that we observe in others. So we wanted to see, what happens. How do people who are listening into a conversation, how do observers perceive this, interaction based on this vocal accommodation process that nobody, again, is consciously attending to? This is happening in the background at a non-conscious level, but we're aware of it at this non-conscious level so that it helps us form impressions of people. So we played the recordings that we gathered in our experiment of all of these groups talking to each other and playing this game. We brought in then panels of people to just listen to those and to provide ratings of their of the speaker's power and prestige. And that's all they knew about them, was just the sound of their voice playing the game. We didn't tell them anything else about the people. We didn't tell them who scored higher or lower on different tests. We just said, listen to this, and who do you think is more prestigious? Who do you think is more dominant? And just like with the speakers themselves who knew the structure of the group, those just listening to it inferred that the person who engaged in less accommodation was more prestigious, and the person who engaged in more accommodation was less dominant. But there was, so the two of them, again, combined, vocal accommodation kind of conveyed both of those types of information to observers, but the effect was a little bit flipped from speakers. So for speakers, prestige was the primary mode of understanding, but for listeners, dominance was the primary mode of understanding what was going on there. So they assumed that whoever was less accommodating had a dominance advantage that the speakers themselves didn't infer, at least at the same level. So they're seeing the same things, but in different ways.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, the studies of debates in competitive situations found that vocal accommodation was related to dominance, but not prestige. Is that
correct?
But you find it's related to both dominance and prestige. Do you have any sort of hypotheses of why the findings in the cooperative context of your study might differ from those of the competitive context of a debate, or whatever competitive context?
Yeah, sure. So there's been a whole lot of research in social psychology over the years looking at how status affects interactions in small groups, and this is kind of building out of that same tradition. And one thing that's been found time and again is that collective, cooperative types of situations are really instantiate or draw our focus to these status differences. In particular ways, they make it really relevant and salient to us, these status differences. When we are trying to achieve a common end with somebody, we're going to defer to somebody who we think has more information or better information, or who we trust more, or who we like more, things like that. In competitive situations where somebody's trying to get the upper hand over somebody, you're not going to be as focused on, say, somebody's education level and deferring to them. You're going to try to beat them in a head-to-head combat. So it becomes much more focused on those antagonistic, dominant type behaviors. So really, I would argue that when in competitive settings, vocal accommodation is picking up on dominance and not prestige, because the hierarchy itself is based only on dominance and not prestige. But in these sort of cooperative groups, prestige and dominance are allowed to mix a little bit more, because people are trying to, they're trying to solve a problem together. They're trying to use whatever information they have to get a right answer, not to beat somebody else. So it's not a competitive, antagonistic approach where we might see, somebody wanting to speak over somebody else or cut them off. This is more of a let's work together and use the best information we have kind of thing.
But it's also interesting that the observers pick that up, because I can imagine a cooperative situation where someone is still saying, well, I really think this is the right answer. This is what we should do. And the other person saying, no, I think this is. But if they're cooperating to get something done, the observers seem to pick up this both prestige and dominance element, whereas they could be saying those exact same sentences in a competitive situation, but in that competitive situation, observers may not pick it up the same way, the dominance. So it's interesting. I mean, maybe I hope I haven't misstated the finding or the understanding, but
no, you're exactly right. So what we kind of conclude at the end of this study here, or these two studies, is that vocal accommodation, we started thinking about it in terms of status, prestige, and dominance, and really what we've kind of come to is that it models, or it captures the hierarchical nature of human interaction. When there is a hierarchy, when somebody is higher or lower than somebody else, whether that be dominance or prestige, that's what vocal accommodation is picking up on. So it's agnostic to whether it is dominance or prestige at the heart of it. It's modeling some difference between people in terms of who's ranked higher or lower, or who's behaving as higher status or more dominant. So it's useful in both competitive and cooperative settings, but it's going to pick up that hierarchical nature of interaction. But it's up to the researcher or the person, the practitioner, to differentiate what's going on there in terms of how it's what dimensions it's probably capturing.
Well, Professor Dippong, this is something that's operating beneath my consciousness and sort of below the radar, but you're excavating it in a illuminating way. And I found the work fascinating, and I thank you for coming here and sharing it with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I also want to say that this is an area of research that I've been really, passionate about, and wanting to get it into the hands of more people who could find other uses for it. So I appreciate this opportunity to, tell more people about it.
Well, we appreciate your willingness to do that as well. Thank you.
Our final segment concerns teacher departures at the end of the school year. In a June 20th article titled "School's Out for Summer and Many Teachers Are Calling It Quits," the Wall Street Journal reported that Bureau of Labor Statistics data show that approximately 300,000 public school teachers and other school personnel left the field between February 2020 and May 2022. Further, a National Education Association survey found that while in August 2021, 37% of teachers said they would leave education sooner than planned, this year, fully 55% of teachers said so. The Wall Street Journal noted that in the last few years, teachers have dealt with the introduction and escalation of remote learning, changing COVID rules, staffing shortfalls, contentious masking debates, fights over what teachers are allowed to discuss in class, and continued high-profile and many no-profile school shootings. There were a total of 249 school shootings in 2021, and 2022 is setting an even faster pace, with 152 school shootings so far. Teachers feel beleaguered. These challenges are layered onto long-standing ones, as teaching has changed in the last 75 years. In 1950, 75% of K-12 teachers were women. In 2019, 74% of pre-K to 12 teachers were women. However, in 1950, 43% of employed women were K-12 teachers. In contrast, in 2019, only 7.9% of employed women were K-12 teachers. Over 70 years, the percentage of teachers who are women has not budged. And it has not budged because a large number of jobs are almost all men or almost all women. This occupational sex segregation is an important social phenomenon. At the same time, far fewer 21st century women are teachers, and the reason for that decline is that between 1950 and today, labor market opportunities for women vastly increased. College-educated women of the mid-20th century were mostly teachers, secretaries, or nurses. College-educated women of the 21st century have many other options as well. Alas, as the opportunities for women have expanded, the pay for teachers has stagnated. Eric Hanushek found that in 1940, women who taught earned more than approximately 68% of female college graduates. In 1940, therefore, teaching was a very good job for women. However, by the year 2000, women who taught earned more than only about 45% of female college graduates. From being firmly in the upper half of pay for college women, teaching is now in the bottom half. As teacher pay has fallen behind the pay of other occupations, it has had effects on the teaching workforce. With pay lagging, between 1988 and the most recent year for which we have nationwide figures, which is 2013, about 8% of teachers switch schools each year. That's a national average. For some schools, the percentage is far higher. Over the same time period, the percentage of teachers leaving the profession each year moved from about 5.8% to 8%. With 8% of teachers changing schools and another 8% leaving teaching altogether, about 10 years ago, one might estimate that the average school would lose 1/6 of its teachers each year. I hasten to note those estimates are pre-COVID. Under COVID, some evidence suggests teacher departures may be higher. While national data collection is underway to determine whether teacher attrition has surged, the data are not yet available. Whatever the level, teacher attrition can affect children. When we compare sets of teachers with different levels of experience, we routinely see that students of teachers with 1 or 2 years of experience do worse than teachers with more than 2 years of experience. But we often do not see much difference between teachers with 5 years of experience compared to teachers with 10 years of experience or even more experience. So it appears that the gain in teacher competence and ability and comfort flatlines after about the 5th year. However, when we track teachers over time and observe teachers' individual growth trajectories, we find a different story. We find steep gains from year 1 to year 4, and we also find continued gains thereafter. The gain after year 4 is not as pronounced as the gain before year 4, but it's steady and accumulates to big differences between teachers who differ by 5 or more years in their amount of experience. What does this all mean? It means that many districts are entrusting the education of the children of their community to teachers who are not seen as meriting even average pay for college graduates. It means that as they do so, teachers are being asked to deal not only with unprecedented challenges, such as navigating changing health protocols and politicized conflict around public health protections with parents and other members of the community, but also with increasing incidences of physical violence. They're being asked to do nothing short of putting their life on the line for their students, while backup may be a door away or nowhere to be found. Faced with these escalating bads for a job with decreasing goods, it means that it is no wonder that many teachers are seeking and finding new, better paid, probably less dangerous alternatives. And finally, given the evidence showing substantial gains in teaching ability with each year of experience, with every experienced teacher who throws up her hands and leaves the profession owing to COVID conflict, school shootings, homework pushback, state legislative micromanaging, and lagging pay, the students deprived of talented teaching, the real losers in this maelstrom of distraction, multiply. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.